Today we have a new perspective. What once was forwards is now backwards. Black stone sky, today we fly into the sky. Hello there and welcome back to Sultan Sanctuary. I was initially considering talking like the Jester to be a gimmick for the entirety of this episode, at least the parts where we travel back and activate all these stone obelisks that we've come across, but that turned out to be a little bit difficult, so that's the only one you're getting from me, I'm afraid. Before we actually make backwards progress and check out all those side areas that we can now access, let's head forward a little bit though, past the Jester who is now gone. Perhaps we'll encounter him again in the future. Very fortuitously, ahead of the Jester is actually a shortcut that takes us back to one of those areas that we were going to explore in the first place. All the way back to the Festering Banquet and right by the Merchant, which is very convenient since we do want to purchase a few more locks of hair so we can upgrade the new weapon that we're using, the scythe. This scythe in particular is the Haymaker. Now, although the scythe class, Reaper, is its own distinct class separate from halberds and spears, it is still governed by the halberd and spear node on the tree of skill, so if you want to use more advanced Reapers, you need to get those nodes. Reapers are a very good weapon class, by the way, a bit weaker compared to halberds, but they're really good for mowing through enemies, especially enemies that are easy to stun, thanks to their long reach. So here we come to our first obelisk, which technically opens up a shortcut gate, but not really a significant one at this point. And it's clear that the developers realize that because they give you an additional reward in the form of that new armor set, the Onyx set. That is a set we won't be wearing for some time because it is a much higher class of heavy armor than we are currently capable of wearing. I believe it's class 4. But I will most likely show it off eventually. We'll see. Fortunately, however, heading this way actually takes us up to another one of the obelisks that we've previously come across. This one at the very top of the Festering Banquet. I'll also just make a side comment about how I'm getting really lucky with rare drops from enemies on this playthrough, and in this video in particular. I'm getting a ton of skullbat wings, which may or may not help out in the future. And I also end up getting quite a few rare drops later on in this episode, for which I'm quite thankful. Now, here we can see a bit of an odd property of the Reaper weapon class. They don't really have a proper critical animation. Instead, doing the critical just does a large swiping attack, similar to the Reaper's strong attack. I think it does more damage, but the animation immediately ends, leaving the enemy that you just parried free to move about and attack you, or you're vulnerable because you're still in the middle of recovering from that attack animation. So while the Reaper weapon class is great for taking down groups of weaker, easily stunned enemies, and even some bosses who are difficult to stun in the first place, for enemies like these, who you'd prefer to parry against, they're really poor, as you can see here. It's difficult even to outrange them because you end up being swung forward by your own attack swings. Definitely not a weapon class that you want to use by itself. You want something else in your other loadout. Anyway, for taking down this Bronze Knight, we actually get a pretty good ring that I elect for us not to use. The Sparkling Ring boosts the healing power of healing prayers, and I believe your healing flasks as well. I could be wrong about that though, since it's a ring that I've not really used much myself. In general, I feel the base healing that you get from the flasks is sufficient, and so I prefer to have those ring slots used for other, more useful rings. But we also picked up another random item, the Kraken Gloves. I believe we acquired the Kraken Helm from a previous Bronze Knight. The only way to pick up the Kraken set in this game is to get it as rare drops from the Bronze Knights. As such, getting it early on is pretty much a matter of pure luck more than anything. Later on, the Bronze Knights end up being respawnable enemies, so you can farm them pretty easily. We'll see that set in its entirety eventually, I think. So, Reapers, as their own weapon class, have their own class-unique weapon combos. Or, I should say, weapon combo. Aside from the universal light-heavy launcher, they only have one weapon combo, and that is light, uplight, downlight, and heavy. If you can stun whatever you're hitting with the entirety of this combo, it absolutely shits out damage, but again, if you're fighting something that can resist those blows, it's almost completely useless, since you'll just get knocked out of your attack string by the enemy's counterattack. So there we picked up an item that we've actually acquired a few of before, the Grey Pearl. While black pearls are used to level up at the Tree of Skill, grey pearls are used to erase progress, and reacquire black pearls that you spent. You can spend 1 grey pearl per node and get back however many black pearls you spent to acquire that node. Now, rather unfortunately, you cannot use that to game the Tree of Skill and set yourself on using class 4 or 5 weapons of a certain weapon class and then erase your previous masteries, because in order to use class 4 or 5 weapons you need all the previous levels of mastery. As such, grey pearls are pretty much purely for fixing mistakes if you leveled into something that you don't end up using at all. So this set here, the Amethyst set, is an interesting one. We're just going to put it on for a little bit here just to see how it looks. If you have an especially good memory, you'll have noticed that we've actually seen that armor set before. That was what the handmaid to the princess in the boat way back in episode 1 was wearing. So we know that she's no longer alive, which doesn't say good things about whether or not our princess is alive as well. And there is a third person who may or may not be alive, and by may or may not I mean is in fact dead. And that's us. First death of the LP, folks. Hooray. So I do finally get to show off what happens when you die. 2 things occur. 1, you lose all the salt that you've acquired. And we'll see what's happened to that. Much like the Dark Souls series from which this is heavily inspired by, we'll be able to reclaim that. Additionally, however, we lose 10% of our gold, the fee claimed by the cleric who drags us back to our nearest shrine or sanctuary. The gold is by far the bigger loss, as you can reacquire all the salt that you lost if you can beat the enemy that killed you. And yeah, since Reapers do not do so well against the Red Lord, at least how I use them, I decided to put the Trident in the second loadout and just use that to repeatedly parry and riposte the dude, which is by far the best way to handle him since he's ridiculously hard to stun with attacks. It's also worth pointing out that any enemy that has absorbed your salt becomes stronger. They have significantly boosted HP, which makes them even more difficult to take down than the first time you fought them. But we do ultimately succeed and even acquire an exceedingly rare drop from the Red Lord, his ear. This item is a bit of a dick move on the game developer's part because much later we will need this item if we want to access a certain NPC merchant's inventory. They will not deal business with us unless we give them one of the Red Lord's ears. And they just so happen to be one of the most useful merchants in the entire game, so locking away the ability to do business with them behind a random drop, not exactly the best game design. IMHO. Thankfully, that will not be an issue for this playthrough. Oh, one other thing I should address regarding the death mechanic, just on the off chance that this does not occur, although that is unlikely. If you die to something other than an enemy, what happens to your salt? If, say, you die to fall damage from gravity, for example. If that occurs, then your salt actually ends up spawning as an additional bat-like enemy, who's pretty easy to kill. So that is by far the better way to die. It makes it so much easier to recover your salt. You just gotta hit the bat a few times and it's dead. But that aside, we finally saw the other side of that one shortcut elevator that we saw all the way back when we first explored Bandit's Pass. And now we have a much easier time dealing with these enemies, for the most part. The Marauders still attack quickly enough that you do have to keep your distance from them, otherwise you will very quickly die. But here you can see the true strength of the Haymaker of the Reaper weapon class. Just cuts through enemies like butter as long as you can stun them reasonably fast, and they don't just eternally dodge out of the way of your attacks as well. Now, there is another stone obelisk on the other side of Bandit's Pass, but we'll be visiting that one later. as that one is the key to progress, as the old salt-soaked man so helpfully informed us a while ago. So we're going to check out the other two obelisks that we've come across in our journey, one of which is conveniently on the top of this sanctuary here. First, however, we will level up, both to increase our HP, give us a bit of an easier time versus the enemies if we do take damage, and also to level up along the tree of skill a little bit further. We're going to become a heavy mace fighter, allowing us to use great hammers and great axes. After all, we did pick up a great hammer back in the Sunken Keep. Great hammers are incredibly strong. They deal the most damage out of pretty much any weapon class, in exchange for being one of the slowest swinging ones, although that can be easily rectified with the Mossy Charm. And if you're particularly eagle-eyed, you may have noticed a mistake that I made in setting up that second gear loadout with the Great Hammer. If you didn't notice that, that's fine. You'll see what comes of that a little bit later. From this obelisk here, we acquire a very useful ring for mages, so we won't be seeing the use of that for some time. Not until we delve back into the heady world of wizardry. So at this point, we only have one other obelisk left to explore, other than the one that we need to use in order to progress. And that one is all the way back after the Queen of Smiles boss fight, so let's use our useful fast travel guide network to get there more efficiently. Whooping first to one of our guides that we set up, and then using him to travel to the Village of Smiles. In the meantime, however, we will also make use of the blacksmith that we put here to upgrade both our haymaker and our great hammer. Make them just a little bit stronger, a little bit more effective at killing, at the art of murder. No, I do not have any weird preoccupations with anything. Why do you ask? In all seriousness here, having a Reaper in one loadout and a Great Hammer in the other is actually a pretty good setup, at least if you're willing to spend the points to use both of those weapon classes. They function pretty similarly, so switching between loadouts won't confuse you by having a differently performing weapon, but they do better in different situations. Reapers being better against crowds of smaller, easily stunned enemies, and Great Hammers being better at large, tough to stun enemies. Or you could just stick with the Great Hammer 24/7 and do just fine. Seriously, Great Hammers is probably the best weapon class in the game. Great Swords might be close, it depends on whether you prefer raw power or speed. Either way, using them pretty much puts the game in easy mode. So, using this obelisk over here takes us to this small side area that's actually rather interesting. If you travel to the end of this slope, you'll find that you can no longer progress. You need an additional movement upgrade that you can acquire later on. In fact, we may acquire that later this episode, ooh. However, you can actually access this area right here, if you just think and jump for it. I use the super jump glitch here, but as long as you're in the lowest two equip load tiers, your jump is high enough that you can make it with a normal jump. If you happen to be using magic, the game's other easy mode, it's actually very worth coming here, as the major item worth collecting here is an additional spell, and a pretty good one at that. A good upgrade over the previous chain lightning spell that we were using last time. It can, however, be a bit of a pain in the butt to actually get to, as you have to do quite a bit of platforming, being careful not to fall to your death to actually find the proper teleporter exit. And right here you can see the big mistake I made with the Great Hammer. I forgot to two-hand it, whoops. We only have the ability to two-hand Class 1 Great Hammers, not one-hand them. So it results in a completely ineffectual swing that just leaves us completely open. I'm very surprised that we didn't end up dying here. Thankfully, things ended up working out, and I do end up finishing off these enemies pretty easily with the Haymaker. As for the enemies themselves, the winged imps aren't all that interesting. They just constantly fly after you and attempt to attack you, and they're pretty quickly to take out as well. They don't have much HP. The weird duck monsters, on the other hand, are actually fairly interesting. They have a rather nasty leaping grab attack, and they will also continually spawn their children from eggs, and if you don't bust the eggs open before they hatch, then you have additional enemies to deal with. So even if you're not a mage, you still end up getting some reward for coming here with the Weeaboo set. We'll be seeing that one in due time. We pick up a lot of armor sets this episode, and I want to give each its fair shake. Here we have one final gauntlet of enemies to deal with before we can pick up that new spell. As you can see here, Great Hammer Supremacy is quite strong indeed. A lot of damage, a lot of stun, and pretty quick swing speed if you're using that Mossy Charm. With the Haymaker as a side, if we want to have a somewhat quicker attack, we're pretty well equipped to deal with this situation, even though we do very nearly die. And then I remember, oh right, I actually have Arcane Weapon equipped. I should probably be using that. And it makes this last one go even quicker. Weapon buffs, by the way, work by adding damage that is proportional to the base damage that they're buffing. So buffs are just as good for slow, heavy-hitting weapons as they are for weak, fast-hitting weapons. Now, depending on which creed you're in, these blade wraiths here, which are an annoying enemy to kill by the way, are very helpful. A mechanic that I've not yet gone over is that you can rank up in your creed and increase your devotion, which is an actual stat listed on your character's stat page, and this gives you various rewards. Some creeds require the ribs that these enemies drop in order to ascend in rank, and this just so happens to be the earliest appearance of this enemy type, otherwise you won't be encountering them for a few more areas. So this is the earliest available farming spot for that item. At long last, we're finally done with the backtracking side stuff, so let's finally make some progress, and actually head into the area for which this episode is named. Well, eventually I mean, as we'll be taking the long way there, by which I mean the way of no editing. Probably should have cut this bit out since it's just going through Bandit's Pass again, but missed opportunities. At least we get to see heads and other assorted body parts go flying as we just mow through these enemies one after another. A bit more successfully than when we came through here backwards a bit ago. I said a bit more successfully, not completely successfully, not flawlessly. Yeah, the dogs are still a bit of a pain in the butt, because unless you can stun them or kill them as they do their jumping grab, you're gonna get grabbed, and bit, and hurt. So, finally we come to this last obelisk here. Before we use it to progress, we're gonna use that key, the bronze key, that we picked up, and use it to acquire another useful item, the Outlaw Great Axe. Great Axes have the exact same moveset as Great Hammers and roughly similar damage, although this one is a bit weaker and has a bit shorter reach than our current Great Hammer. The main reason to use Great Axes over Great Hammers is that they typically do slashing damage while Great Hammers typically do blunt damage. And damage type actually matters pretty significantly in this game. We're reaching the point where we'll start to come across enemies and bosses especially who have blisteringly high defenses to some damage types, and so if you attempt to use that damage type, you're not gonna have a good time. We may in fact be seeing that ourselves as we enter the Castle of Storms, after having a quick gear change. Let's put on that amethyst set for good. It's a pretty nice looking light armor set after all. So this area here is pretty fun. They immediately introduce you to a ton of new enemy types, some of whom are quite different from anything we faced before, such as these giant armor sets. These guys are pretty nasty if you don't have a high source of bludgeoning damage. Thankfully we do, so they're not all that bad. Of greater concern are the enemies aiding the armor giant, the flaming skulls that constantly chase after you once they've noticed you, and the axe-lobbing slaves. But again, we have a great hammer, so it's really not all that big of a deal in the grand scheme of things. In addition to new enemy types, this area also gives us a new trap type, the first instance of which we can actually use to our advantage to easily kill this bronze knight over here. At least as long as you're paying attention. If you're not, you're just as likely to die as he is. Oddly enough, usually that lightning trap causes him to collapse, making him easily finished off. It didn't happen this time for whatever reason, but the Great Hammer came in to save the day. We also pick up a new lightning spell. At this point, the game actually starts giving you spells fairly frequently in the environment. This is where they start expecting you to use magery if you don't know about the secrets. And appropriately enough, we have a new mage enemy type, the Royal Court Sorcerer, who is a huge pain in the butt to deal with. It doesn't seem like it currently, but you'll see why they can be so dangerous later on. Again, the Great Hammer is putting in a lot of work here for making this area so much easier than it otherwise would be, since it allows us to take out enemies much more quickly than pretty much any other weapon class. This area is where dex weapons really start to show their weakness. They just don't output enough burst damage to be able to kill enemies efficiently enough to make them not pains in the butts. As for that spell that we picked up, the Ray of Searing, it's actually a prayer, an offensive prayer, a rarity in this game. Unfortunately, it's not very good, so if you like the idea of using offensive prayers of being a battle cleric, well, I'm afraid you're going to be found wanting. Your battle is going to have to come from maces and great maces. Here we pick up a new ring, the Impencrest ring. It's not especially good in most situations, it just gives you more fire resistance. And really, how useful could that be in a wet, rainy area like this? Not very, methinks. Yeah, one amusing thing about this encounter in particular is that if you get hit by the armor set's shockwaves, you're likely to be knocked upward on the platforms where he can no longer reach you. He actually ends up giving you a little bit of an assist. Oh hey, it's our wandering knight friend from earlier. Let's see what he has to say now. Yeah, we made it, and so did you. Impressive. Apparently there is a thief somewhere nearby with a useful rune, as well as a pesky dragon that we may need to deal with. Maybe that fire resistance ring will come in handy. Well, that's all the advice he has to offer, so let's unlock a dubiously useful shortcut. Fast travel in this game is just so convenient to use that a lot of the shortcuts like this aren't really all that handy in my opinion. This one in particular is nigh on useless because there is a sanctuary right here, so unless you're half blind and miss it, that shortcut really is something you're never going to use. Although it is cool in concept, just a giant elevator leading all the way from the castle in the sky back down to the ground. I wouldn't especially recommend leaving any stone idols here because the Castle of Storms is not likely an area that you're going to be returning to. If you leave a stone idol, it should be purely for the bonus that that idol gives, and not for the merchant that it summons. In that regard, placing a blacksmith here can be quite useful as that increases your attack power, and that can be pretty handy against the boss, who is definitely a bit of a toughie. I'll probably be saying that a lot from now on, as this is the point where the bosses actually start getting a fair bit difficult. Anyway, making our way back around, let's continue to progress through the castle. And immediately pick up a new armor set. This is the gear that the Hunter class starts with, and we'll be wearing it for a little bit. It looks cool, but it's not especially good defensive-wise. Oddly enough, even though you'd think a hunter would be light on their feet and quick and agile, their armor set is actually counted as heavy armor, class 0 heavy armor, and it is appropriately heavy. So despite looking really cool, it's one of the worst armor sets from a functional standpoint. We won't be sticking with it for too long, I'm afraid. So here we encounter another sorcerer, and we can finally start to see just why they're so dangerous. their attacks can be pretty tricky to avoid, and they can do them pretty quickly, so if you don't take them out immediately, they're a right pain in the ass, especially if they're accompanied by other enemies. But as you saw by my little dance of joy there, we got exceedingly lucky by picking up its ear. You'll see why it's such a good drop in the future. For now though, we'll try and make our way to that NPC that we spied above. Unfortunately, our jump is not good enough to make it up there from where we currently are, so we'll just have to continue to progress through the castle. Here we pick up a very interesting shield, the Phoenix Rondache. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, so I'll just call it the Phoenix Shield from now on. It's notable in that even though its physical defenses are poor, it blocks 100% of fire damage. Reminder that we also picked up a ring that boosted our fire damage earlier. Not to mention, we know that there's a dragon somewhere in this castle. The game is not so subtly hinting at you that maybe you want some more fire defense. And as a result, we're going to be equipping the blacksmith set that we wore before, because it is the light armor set with the greatest amount of fire defense, at least at this point. We are also going to be de-equipping our helmet so we can keep our equip load sufficiently low. You're really going to want to be in either the first or second equip load tiers for this boss fight. Not being able to roll is not a good idea, or not having a good roll, rather. I also make a little bit of a mistake here with my two loadout setups. I decided to go with the Haymaker for its sheer speed, and then in the second loadout go with a sword so that way I can actually show off the usefulness of the Phoenix Shield. The reason that that's a mistake is that the upcoming boss fight, his defenses vary considerably from damage type to damage type. Notably, he has 50 defense for bludgeoning damage in most elemental damage types, lightning, arcane, and holy, but he has 250 resistance for slashing, and that's the damage type that both of the weapons that we're currently using deal. So we're actually going into this fight a little bit gimped from a pure DPS perspective. And trust me when I say that this is a boss that you want to have as much DPS as possible for, because it gets quite nasty. Oh, and I made a quick stop back to a previous sanctuary to level up so that way we could actually equip that shield. I thought it was a class 1 shield, but it was actually a class 2 shield. Anyway, before we actually get to the boss, we have a little bit of exploration left for us. And it is exploration absolutely worth doing, as the item we're about to pick up is incredibly good. It is the Grasping Ring, one of the items that we could have chosen as our starting effect. What it does, and the reason we're equipping it right now, is it boosts the amount of salt that you collect from enemies. A 10% boost, to be specific, which is nothing to turn up your nose at. Naturally, being able to have it equipped from the start of the game is incredibly useful, which is why it's one of the better starting effects. The only reason I went with the Amber Idol is because that itself is a rare item that to get a lot of, you're probably going to have to farm enemies, so it just helps make this Let's Play a bit more smooth. But enough about how the sausage is made. Let's get to the boss fight, which, as I've not so subtly hinted at many times now, is not gonna go so smoothly. The Kraken Worm here is not a boss that is difficult to predict what it's going to do. Its attacks are all heavily telegraphed in advance. The tricky thing is that all of his attacks have a very wide reach, sometimes going across the entirety of the screen, and if you just eat the hit, you're going to take a lot of damage. And that's why the Phoenix Shield is so handy, because it makes one of his deadlier attacks, his Fire Breath, completely neutralized. So far it seems like the fight is going pretty well, and that's because the Kraken Worm actually starts off fairly tame. The only thing that's likely to trip you up is that the tell for its Fire Breath and the tell for its Tail Swipe are fairly similar, so it can be easy to get tricked by that, thinking he's going to do the other attack and thus get hit. His jump attack has a deceptively small hitbox. As long as you're behind where he lands, you're not going to get hit. but it's when he gets down to less than half of his health that he becomes a very nasty customer indeed. Like pretty much every other boss that we've encountered up till now, that makes him way more aggressive, and he even gains a new, much quicker attack. This is also where the Phoenix Shield shows its weakness. While it's godlike at deflecting away flame, it is absolutely garbage for defending against anything else. Add to that the fact that the Kraken Worm is happy to mix up each of its physical attacks, which each has its own dodge timing, along with its flame breath, and you have someone who is very difficult to avoid taking damage from. And as we've already gone over, he does quite a lot of damage indeed. The fact that we're using probably the worst Creed healing item is just an added kick to the face. Admittedly, one that is entirely my fault. I really probably should have rejoined Devourer's Light, or at least joined the 3, so I could have used the Flask or the Water of Blessing. At this point, the Kraken Worm is aggressive enough that even though its HP is so low, we can rarely find the opportunity to actually safely hit him. One of the better moments is actually when he flies up into the air to do his long-range Flame Breath attack, and it's actually one of the moments where you're actually given a moment of peace. Unfortunately, that moment of peace is taken from us because we managed to stun him, thus taking him out of that animation, and he proceeded to do his much more dangerous attacks, which resulted in our untimely death. Yeah, while stunning normal enemies is pretty helpful, stunning bosses tends to actually work out poorly like that, because you end up breaking them out of their recovery animation, which ends up giving you less time to actually safely hit them. It's a bit poorly designed of a mechanic, that's for sure. Well, at least this gives me an opportunity to show off how death works in relation to bosses. Much like regular enemies, they steal your salt, but you don't have to actually successfully kill them. As you can see by that little arrow indicator on their health bar, you only need to lower their health to that indicator, and then you'll get all of your salt back. And then you can say use a guide's horn or a bell to leave the boss fight if you happen to have a lot of salt that you want to spend and make yourself stronger. And that way the game is quite forgiving actually. So at this point I feel like we've seen the totality of what the boss is capable of. So as soon as we recover our salt, rather than showing off the rest of the attempt, we're just going to skip to the end. No need to watch that entire song and dance again after all. And the Kraken Worm is felled. Sorry, Wandering Knight, you were a little bit too slow. At the very least, for all the trouble that we went through, we do get a truckload of both gold and salt. So it's not a boss that is not appropriately rewarding. And there's an even better reward beyond, being held by this new NPC. This here is the thief that the Wandering Knight mentioned earlier. She's the best thief in the 8 kingdoms, but she's not exactly a fighter. Well, no worries, lady, we've killed the dragon for you. Perhaps you can slay mighty monsters. Maybe not with a dagger, however. Daggers are pretty poor in this game. With that aside, we've acquired a new brand, the Shadow Flip brand, and definitely one of the more useful ones, at least it has more applications than the gravity one. This allows us to jump off walls and get to plenty of new places. And immediately it lets us pick up a useful new piece of treasure that we'll check out next time, as I'm afraid that's all we have time for today, my friends. Be sure to stay salty.